The collapse of the false self doesn't happen all at once. It begins in the quiet spaces, the ones between performances, where no one is watching and the silence is heavy. It starts when the usual tricks stop working, when the attention no longer satisfies, and when the praise lands hollow. The false self, so carefully crafted and rehearsed, begins to buckle under the weight of its own emptiness. It's not that something dramatic happens to cause the collapse. It's that nothing happens and the stillness reveals the truth, that everything they built to be impressive, untouchable, and admired was never real enough to feel like home. The false self is born out of fear. Fear of rejection, of inadequacy, of being seen and not loved. So instead of risking that pain, they construct a version of themselves designed to avoid it. This self is polished, controlled, admired even. It knows how to charm, how to win, how to stay one step ahead of judgment. It wears competence like armor and confidence like camouflage. But underneath it all is a child who never learned that they were enough just as they were. So they built a self that would be. This construction isn't conscious at first. It starts as adaptation, learning what earns approval and what doesn't. Learning when to speak and when to disappear. Learning which emotions are safe and which ones invite ridicule or abandonment. Over time, those adaptations become identity, not a real one, but a believable one. One that performs well in rooms where depth isn't required. One that shines in curated spaces but dims in intimacy. The false self knows how to earn love, but not how to receive it. Because receiving love requires being known, and being known means being vulnerable, and vulnerability was never safe. But the thing about the false self is that it can't carry the soul. It can't hold the weight of real connection. It might achieve admiration, but never closeness. It might inspire envy, but never intimacy. It might win respect, but never trust. And eventually the cracks begin to show. A relationship falters, and they can't fix it with charm. A friend pulls away, and they don't know why. A moment of failure arrives, and they have no way to sit with it, only to spin it. And in those moments, they come face to face with something unbearable, the possibility that the self they've built is not enough to be truly loved. The collapse is not just painful, it's disorienting. Because if this false self is not real, then who are they? If they're not the one who always has the answer, the one who's always strong, the one who's always right, then what's left? The collapse strips away the certainties, the identities worn like costumes. It forces them to sit in the nakedness of their own humanity, which they've spent a lifetime avoiding. And what they find there is terrifying at first: shame, grief, confusion, emptiness. Not because those parts are inherently bad, but because they've never been held with compassion. They've only ever been denied, repressed, or buried under performance. As the false self unravels, so do the relationships built on it. People who are drawn to the mask begin to fall away, unable or unwilling to meet the real person emerging underneath. And that too feels like loss, even if it's necessary. Because what dies in the collapse is not just an illusion of self, it's an entire ecosystem of validation built on pretending. And for someone who has never experienced love without earning it, that loss can feel like death. But it's not. It's the necessary grief that precedes authenticity. What's left after the collapse is raw and unfamiliar. There is no script for how to be when you are no longer performing. There is no guidebook for how to connect when you're not managing impressions. It's awkward, exposing, and profoundly human. It requires learning a new language, the language of presence, of humility, of truth without decoration. And that language doesn't come easily. It must be learned slowly, often painfully, through the practice of being real in spaces where being real was once dangerous. The false self doesn't go quietly. It fights for its life. It tells you that without it, you are nothing. That without the performance, no one will stay. That vulnerability is weakness and control is safety. And every time you resist the urge to return to it, you are choosing courage over comfort. Not the kind of courage that wins awards or earns applause, but the quiet courage of becoming who you really are, even when no one else is watching. Especially then. Because that's where the real self begins, not in perfection, but in presence. Not in being right, but in being true. Truth doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't perform. It just stands there still, calm, and impossibly clear, and when it does, it becomes a mirror. Not the kind that flatters or filters, but the kind that reflects everything exactly as it is, without distortion. It is this kind of truth that brings people to their knees, not because it attacks them, but because it offers no escape. No excuses, no more pretending. For someone who has built a life around controlling perception, truth is the ultimate threat, because truth doesn't play by the same rules as illusion. It doesn't seek validation. It doesn't need to be liked. It simply reveals, and for a person who's constructed their identity out of smoke and mirrors, truth is the one thing they've spent their entire life avoiding. They know its power. They know its weight. They know that the moment truth steps into the room, all of the elaborate strategies they've relied on, charm, control, projection, distortion, start to lose their effectiveness. They become obsolete. The moment truth appears, everything else stops working. The gaze of truth is not unkind, but it is unrelenting. It doesn't blink. It doesn't soften, it doesn't look away when things get uncomfortable. And it's that very refusal to flinch that makes it so devastating, because it forces a reckoning. Not just with facts or situations or timelines, but with the self who you are when no one's watching, when no one's admiring, when there's nothing left to perform. When the truth arrives, it dismantles performance piece by piece. It holds up the mirror and says, look. And what's reflected back isn't just the surface, it's the core. The motivations, the manipulations, the choices made out of fear, the words said to control, the omissions meant to protect an image. All of it comes into view. And the person looking into that mirror must decide whether to see it. That's the most dangerous part of truth, not that it reveals, but that it offers the choice to see or to turn away. Some will run. They'll double down on the illusion. They'll try to explain away what they see or blame the mirror for being cruel. Because if they were to truly face the reflection, they'd have to admit that the version of themselves they've shown the world isn't whole, isn't real, isn't grounded in anything more than fear of not being enough. And that fear runs so deep, it's often the very foundation of their entire identity. But others, though few, will pause. They'll look. And in the looking, something inside begins to shift. Because truth doesn't just expose, it invites a return, a remembering. A reckoning with the parts of us that have been silenced, hidden, or exiled. And while that reckoning may feel like a breaking, it's actually an opening. An invitation to step out of the performance and into something more honest, more grounded, more whole. Yet for the one who has spent years cultivating control, that invitation feels like annihilation. Truth doesn't come with applause. It doesn't offer a spotlight. It doesn't let them control the narrative. It strips away the ability to be seen in a particular way. It removes the filters. It puts the real self vulnerable, uncertain, messy into full view. And for someone who equates vulnerability with weakness, that's unbearable. They don't know how to exist in a world where they can't manage every perception, where their worth isn't propped up by admiration, fear, or dominance. Truth, in that sense, is not a confrontation. It is a confrontation with self, not with others. It doesn't demand justice, it demands honesty. And that is the deeper, more terrifying ask, because being honest with others is hard enough, but being honest with ourselves about who we've been, how we've hurt, what we've feared, that is where real courage lies. That is what makes truth so painful. Not because it condemns, but because it reveals what we've worked so hard to keep hidden even from ourselves. The mirror of truth is not cruel. It is precise. And in its clarity, it offers a kind of freedom, but only if the person looking into it is willing to lay down their armor. If they are not, then what they see will feel like judgment, even though it's simply reflection. The hardest part isn't the moment the truth is seen. It's the moment they realize they can't unsee it. The performance, the mask, the carefully controlled image, it can't survive in that kind of light. And for someone who has built their entire sense of self around never being truly known, that moment is more than uncomfortable. It is shattering. Powerlessness is not always loud. Sometimes it enters like a whisper, almost unnoticed at first. It creeps in through the cracks of failed control, misunderstood silences, or unmet expectations. But when it finally makes itself known, it doesn't just take the air out of the room, it takes the illusion with it. The illusion that power can be held without trust, that influence can replace intimacy. That control is a substitute for connection. When powerlessness arrives, it is not just a moment, it is a reckoning. To someone who has built their world on the idea that power is safety, that dominance is protection, and that being above others means never being left behind, powerlessness is terrifying. It is not merely the absence of power. It is the collapse of a belief system that says, I can control how others see me. If I can stay one step ahead, then I won't have to feel the vulnerability I buried a long time ago. But power built on fear doesn't last. It can't. Because fear is never satisfied. It always wants more. And eventually, even the most practiced performance can no longer hold it up. The reckoning begins when the usual tools stop working. When silence is met with steady presence instead of retreat. When intimidation meets someone who refuses to shrink. When emotional manipulation no longer confuses and lies no longer distort. These moments are not dramatic from the outside, but for the person who has relied on control as their armor, they are devastating. Because what they encounter isn't resistance, it's neutrality. It's clarity. It's someone who is no longer caught in their storm. And that is when the illusion of power begins to unravel. Power, in its healthy form, is rooted in mutual respect, vulnerability, and trust. But when someone has used it as a weapon, as a shield, as a way to mask their own inadequacies, losing it feels like losing their identity. They have built their sense of self not on who they are, but on how others respond to them. So when those responses change, when fear turns to indifference, when obedience turns to boundaries, when adoration turns to truth, they are left with a terrifying question. Who am I without the power? That question does not land gently, it lands like an earthquake, because the answer is not clear. Often they don't know. They've never been taught how to build worth without performance. They've never been safe enough to explore identity outside of dominance. Vulnerability was never modeled as a strength. It was something to avoid, to punish, to bury. So when powerlessness strips away the illusion, what's left is not just discomfort. It's panic, because now they are exposed, not just to others, but to themselves. There's a moment in every reckoning when pretending becomes impossible. When the mask becomes too heavy. When even the person wearing it can no longer believe in the image they've been selling. And this moment doesn't just threaten their relationships, it threatens the internal structure of who they think they are. Because without control, they feel invisible. Without dominance, they feel unworthy. Without being needed or feared, they feel forgotten. And yet what they're actually experiencing isn't invisibility. It's reality. And that's the most painful part. Not that the power is gone, but that it was never real to begin with. It was borrowed. It was projected. It was conditional. True powerlessness isn't just a loss of influence, it's a mirror reflecting how much of their life has been a performance. It's the unbearable recognition that they've pushed people away not because they weren't loved, but because they never let themselves be seen. It's the grief of realizing that the connections they thought they had were built on fear, not trust, on transaction, not intimacy. It's realizing that they've spent years trying to outrun shame, only to find that it was inside them all along. And yet the reckoning doesn't just destroy, it reveals what was never sustainable. It shines a light on the fragility of control. It pulls back the curtain on the cost of never allowing oneself to be truly vulnerable. But for someone who has never known a safe place for vulnerability, that revelation feels more like a death than a rebirth. It feels like everything is crumbling, when in truth, what's crumbling is everything that was never real. The tragedy is that powerlessness could be a portal. It could be the beginning of rebuilding on truth, on humility, on authenticity. But it rarely feels that way in the moment. In the moment, it feels like drowning, like falling without anything to hold on to, like silence where there used to be attention, like stillness where there used to be control. And for the one who believed power made them worthy, it is not just unsettling, it is unbearable. Because in that silence, they are forced to face themselves without applause, without fear, without a mask. And that is where the reckoning begins. Vulnerability is the one thing we all long for and fear in equal measure. It is the space where we are most human, most real, most reachable. But for some, vulnerability is a risk they have never been able to take. It is the thing they learned early on to deny, avoid, and bury. Somewhere along the way, they absorbed the belief that showing weakness was a liability, that admitting pain would lead to rejection, and that exposing emotion would only be used against them. So they crafted lives built on distance, not closeness, control, not connection, appearance, not authenticity. Denying vulnerability becomes second nature. It's in the subtle refusals to admit when something hurts. It's in the carefully rehearsed stories designed to impress but never reveal. It's in the relentless pursuit of being perceived as invulnerable, always calm, always composed, always right. The more polished the exterior becomes, the harder it is to recognize that underneath it all is a deep, aching hunger to be seen and accepted, not for what they do or achieve, but for who they really are. But the idea of being seen in that raw, unfiltered way feels unbearable. So they deny that part of themselves entirely. They become skilled at masking, not just to others, but to themselves. They convince themselves that they don't need anyone, that emotions are a distraction, that self-reliance is safer than intimacy. Vulnerability becomes a thread, a crack in the foundation of the false self they've spent years constructing. And so it gets pushed further down, hidden behind layers of defensiveness, perfectionism, and control. To the outside world, they may appear confident, powerful, even charismatic. But inside, there's a quiet desperation to keep the walls intact because they fear that if the truth of who they are is ever exposed, they will lose everything. But vulnerability has a way of surfacing. It doesn't stay buried forever. It waits sometimes patiently, sometimes urgently for a moment when the mask slips, when the performance falters, when the person on the other side finally stops playing along. And when that moment comes, it's not always dramatic. It might look like a conversation that doesn't go according to plan, a silence that isn't filled, a boundary that isn't budged, but the effect is seismic. Because in that moment, the denial no longer holds. What's exposed is not weakness, it's humanity. It's the fear that's been living underneath the bravado. It's the longing that's been hidden beneath the manipulation. It's the pain that has gone unnamed for too long. Vulnerability denied is a wound, and when that denial breaks, the wound bleeds. Not because someone else caused it in that moment, but because it was never allowed to heal. The exposure is not just about being seen, it's about having nowhere left to hide. For someone who has never allowed themselves to feel vulnerable, this moment is terrifying. The emotions come rushing in without warning: shame, fear, grief, regret. They're not used to sitting with these feelings. They've built an entire identity around staying ahead of them. But now there's no performance to return to, no audience left to impress, no illusion left to maintain. They are left with what they were always running from, themselves. And that is the moment that breaks something, not because vulnerability is destructive, but because denial is. When vulnerability is finally exposed after years of suppression, it feels like collapse. But what's actually collapsing is the defense system. The facade, the walls that kept people out in pain in. This moment has the power to transform, but only if it is met with truth, not shame. Because vulnerability is not the enemy, it's the path. But for someone who has never known how to walk it, the first step feels like a fall. They may lash out, retreat, or shut down entirely. The exposure is raw, it's unfiltered. And it brings with it the terrifying possibility of being known. To be known without a mask is to risk being rejected for who you truly are. But it is also the only way to be loved. That is the paradox of vulnerability. It is the birthplace of connection, but also the thing most feared by those who have spent their lives avoiding pain. And when the denial finally gives way and vulnerability is exposed not by choice but by inevitability, there is nowhere to run. Only the truth remains. And that truth is this: the very thing they thought would destroy them is the only thing that can set them free. But freedom has a cost, and the first payment is surrender. Empathy is often misunderstood as softness, as something optional or sentimental, as if it belongs only in quiet conversations or moments of grief. But empathy is not weakness. It is the most courageous, disarming, and subversive force in any human interaction. It refuses to participate in power games. It doesn't take sides with ego or seek control. It listens without fixing, witnesses without judging, and holds space without trying to dominate it. And for someone who has spent their life surviving through detachment, performance, and manipulation, empathy is not just uncomfortable, it is threatening. Because empathy asks us to drop the armor. And for some, armor has always felt like safety. The end game of every interaction rooted in control is ultimately emptiness. It may achieve temporary compliance, admiration, or even fear, but it never creates connection. It never inspires loyalty born out of trust or intimacy born out of truth. Because the moment we prioritize winning over understanding, we lose the very thing that makes us human. Empathy is the answer that power can't see. It's the solution that doesn't demand to be right. It's the voice that whispers, you don't have to fight your way into belonging. Empathy doesn't mean agreeing. It doesn't mean letting people off the hook or abandoning boundaries. It means seeing someone's pain without trying to outpace it, outshine it, or weaponize it. For someone who's never felt safe enough to reveal their own vulnerability, the idea of offering space for someone else's can feel unbearable. But empathy is the only thing that breaks the cycle of defensiveness. When we meet manipulation with empathy instead of retaliation, the pattern is interrupted. Not because we're weak, but because we've chosen a different kind of strength, the strength to stay grounded when everything in us wants to armor up. Empathy is the final threat to the false self, because it doesn't engage with the performance at all. It doesn't get seduced by charm or confused by anger. It goes deeper, asking questions the mask cannot answer. It wonders about the pain underneath the posturing. It doesn't get distracted by control tactics. It sees through them and gently asks, what are you protecting? And that question, unspoken but ever present, is what undoes the illusion. Because there is always something being protected, some early pain, some hidden fear, some forgotten need. And empathy invites it forward without shame. To someone used to controlling relationships through narrative and perception, empathy feels like loss of power. But what it actually offers is a kind of power they've never known, one rooted in mutuality, not dominance. One that doesn't require someone else to be small for them to feel secure. One that offers dignity, not leverage. But to receive that kind of empathy, they would have to show the parts of themselves they've been taught to hide. And that is where the internal war begins, because they long to be seen, but only on their terms. They want connection, but without exposure. They crave being understood, but fear being known. Empathy breaks that cycle. It says you can't have real connection without truth. It doesn't punish, but it does illuminate. And illumination is dangerous to a system built on control. When empathy steps into the room, it does so quietly, without agenda. But it changes the energy completely. There is no longer a battle to be won, only a truth to be faced. The old tactics, deflection, dismissal, blame no longer land. Because empathy doesn't argue. It just sees. And being seen when you're not ready to be is the most destabilizing experience of all. But something else happens in the presence of true empathy. For the first time, the person who's always been performing starts to feel the possibility of being accepted without the performance. That idea is foreign, terrifying, and magnetic. Because underneath all the manipulation is someone who desperately wants to be loved. Not for their ability to control the room or the story or the people in it, but for who they are when all of that is gone. Empathy offers that possibility. It says you don't have to earn love by being perfect. You're already enough, but hearing that and believing it are not the same. And for someone who has never believed it, empathy feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, inviting and paralyzing. Empathy is not a technique. It's not a strategy. It's a posture, a willingness to stay present even when things get uncomfortable, especially when they get uncomfortable. It is the quiet rebellion against every lie that says love has to be earned, that worth has to be proven, that connection must be managed. It is the most disarming response to power because it doesn't seek to dismantle it through force. It simply renders it unnecessary. In the presence of empathy, power games fall flat because empathy speaks in a language that control can't understand and the false self can't answer. And in that space, something true begins, not because someone lost, but because no one needed to win. The unraveling is never clean. It doesn't arrive with clarity or closure. It begins in fragments, moments that seem small until they aren't. A glance held too long. A silence that lingers where words used to live. A truth that refuses to stay buried. And suddenly, the script no longer works. The rhythm breaks. What used to be predictable becomes unfamiliar. For someone who's always been the one to control the narrative, this moment feels impossible. Because it is not just the loss of control, it's the loss of the illusion that control was ever real. But the unraveling isn't happening to them. Not really. It's happening around them. Because this time, someone else chose truth over fear. Someone else stopped playing the part they were assigned. Someone else no longer flinches in the face of blame or shrinks under the weight of guilt. And that change is what begins to tear the old dynamic apart. The unraveling is what happens when the other person refuses to carry what was never theirs. When they lay down the roles they were given: caretaker, appeaser, enabler, and choose something unfamiliar but honest. At first, it seems like resistance, a phase, a misunderstanding. But it's not. It's a returning to self, a choice to no longer participate in a story that required silence, self-betrayal, and emotional acrobatics just to keep the peace. And that choice begins to shift the air. Because it's not loud or confrontational. It's quiet, clear, rooted. And that kind of grounded presence is far more disruptive than any argument. It says, without words, I am no longer available for this. And in that stillness, the unraveling begins. For the person who's always held the center of control, the shift is disorienting. They've spent so long orchestrating responses, calculating consequences, and reading every room like a chessboard that they don't know how to function without that power. And when the usual tactics stop working, when the sighs don't spark guilt, when the silence doesn't spark apology, when the charm doesn't soften boundaries, they begin to flail. Not because they are being harmed, but because they are being met with truth. And truth doesn't bend. It is in this unraveling that their power begins to lose gravity, because the only power they ever had was the power others gave them. Through fear, through compliance, through silence. But now the dynamic has shifted, and that power is no longer on offer. What's left is not partnership, not intimacy, just emptiness where connection used to pretend to live. And the unraveling becomes undeniable. This is not the kind of fall that happens overnight. It's slow, incremental. It's the absence of control disguised as confusion. It's every moment someone else refuses to react, refuses to chase, refuses to explain themselves just to avoid discomfort. And for the person at the center of the unraveling, this is unbearable, because it was never about connection, it was about control masquerading as closeness. And now, without the dance, they're left standing in the silence of their own making. The unraveling feels cruel to the one losing control. It feels like betrayal, abandonment, punishment. But it's none of those things. It's a liberation, just not for them. It's the quiet revolution of someone reclaiming their worth, someone who finally stopped confusing love with sacrifice, who realized that boundaries are not cruelty but clarity, who recognized that being loyal to a lie is not the same as being loyal to love. The unraveling is what happens when the system of pretending breaks under the weight of truth. This is the beginning, but not for the one who always demanded the spotlight. It's the beginning for the one who dimmed themselves to keep the peace, the one who took on shame that wasn't theirs, the one who made themselves small so someone else could feel big. For them, this unraveling is not destruction, it's emergence. It's the space where self-respect can finally breathe, where joy doesn't have to be negotiated, where connection becomes a choice instead of a performance. And though the one losing control may rage, may spiral, may grasp for what used to work, there's no going back. Because once the mask is seen, it can't be unseen. Once the truth is spoken, echoes louder than any accusation. And in that echo, something new grows, not for the one who relied on fear, but for the one who chose freedom. The unraveling is not the end of the story, it's the end of a story that never told the truth, and the beginning of one that finally can.